Hi, I'm Jo Weir, and I'm a member of Bermondsey Welcomes Refugees. I want to thank everyone who's already donated to our cause, and we will be showing details at the end of tonight's event for anyone who still wants to support our work. I also want to thank Sans Films, where we're holding this, because they've been extremely supportive of our work. And I want to introduce our speaker. So tonight's event, it's appropriate because we have a new full moon tonight, and we're going to be talking about space exploration. So I'm happy to introduce my friend, Tira Schubart. Tira is a journalist who's covered all kinds of events globally for many broadcasters. She's a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and an ambassador for the Science Museum. Over to you, Tira.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome, and thank you for joining us on this talk. It's going to be about the astonishing world of space exploration, and so we're going to talk a little bit about some history, about the space race, how we got to where we are, and then some of the amazing things that are happening now. So I can't think of a better place to start than the image of Earthrise, which all of a sudden I can't see. But Earthrise is an iconic photo that was taken by Bill Anders on Christmas Eve 1968 on the Apollo 8 mission. Now, this was the first manned mission to go into deep space. Apollo 8 didn't land on the moon, but it orbited the moon. And there's so many remarkable things about this image that seeing Earth...
Sorry to interrupt. I think I'm going to give you your picture because you can't do the lecture without a picture. I don't know why it's going...
This is an interruption, yes.
Just as we were about to go.
Righto. So...
even though we're live, I'm sure people
this is...
understand.
The astronauts never had this kind of problem. But on the other hand, they didn't have Olivier to come in and rescue them like this.
I'm sure they did.
Let's see.
Here we go.
And so we want to go back to the top. Oh, no, we're going the other way. Okay, here we are, Earthrise. The iconic photo that was taken by Bill Anders, astronaut Bill Anders, on Christmas Eve. Now, this was such an astonishing image. I know it's something that everybody sees. This is an image people see all the time now. But Earthrise was the first time that we ever saw a photograph of the Earth in relationship to another heavenly body, and it had a very powerful effect on people. Now remember that only 24 people, all astronauts, all men, have seen the whole Earth from outer space, because in low Earth orbit, where most astronauts are, and cosmonauts, you don't see the whole Earth, you just see part of it. So this image, which is called the blue marble, is another one that comes from Apollo, the Apollo age. When this image came out, it really created a cultural, a creative outpouring on Earth, and it's held responsible also for kickstarting the environment movement to look back and see the whole of Earth. But let's go back and discover, how did we get here? Well, all of this was spurred on by what we call the space race between the superpowers, which had its origins back in the 19th century. So long before the Cold War, long before the Soviet Union even existed, there was a fascination in Russia with all things space. And it was fueled by science fiction. Here we are, Jules Verne's, this is a poster from the film they made of it, Jules Verne's book, From the Earth to the Moon. It was a tale of how a rocket was launched from Florida, remarkably, yes, Florida, using an enormous cannon to power it. Like so many of Jules Verne's stories, like The Submarine and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he predicted the future. Jules Verne predicted that jukebox, television, solar power, skywriting, video phones, and lasers. The year that the book, The Earth from the Moon, was published in 1865, Constantine Silkowski, let's have a look at him. Konstantin Silkowski was an 8-year-old boy living in a small Russian village and about to lose his hearing due to a bout of scarlet fever. Silkowski read Jules Verne's novel when it was translated into Russian, and it transformed his life. It fired his imagination. He became a space visionary and a scientist with theories, correct theories, about how to power rockets and use liquid fuel to launch them in order to escape Earth's gravity. All this while he was a teacher in 19th century provincial Russia. And of course, he wrote science fiction too, including tales of a cosmonautical team that lived on a spaceship using the weightless conditions for scientific experiments, which rather prefigures what's happening on the International Space Station right now. Meanwhile, another rocketry pioneer was Robert Goddard in the United States. Now, he came up with the same theories that Silkowski had. You need liquid fuel, worked out escape velocities, and even launched the first rocket, which is pretty tiny, as you can see in this photograph. It only went up 12 meters. But Goddard believed that we would get to the moon, and that when a rocket hit the moon, you could load it with gunpowder and it could implode and flash, thus indicating that the mission was successful. This caused so much mockery in the press, it really blighted the rest of his career. And at the same time, another pioneer of rocketry was in Germany, Hermann Obers, again with the same theory. Now, amazingly, none of these men knew about each other. They didn't know about each other's work. Silkowski died a respected and venerated figure in the Soviet Union in 1935, untouched by Stalin's purges. But one of his admirers, a brilliant young aircraft designer called Sergei Korolev, wasn't so lucky. Here is Korolev at a slightly later stage in his life. He was chucked into a Siberian gulag in 1938 and starved and beaten and somehow managed to survive, and was actually rather rescued by the outbreak of the Second World War, because he was released to design bombers and then later work on the development of rocket engines. Now, on the other side, working in the Second World War, working for the Germans, working for the Nazi war effort, was a brilliant scientist who had been mentored by Hermann Obers, an aristocratic man called Wernher von Braun. Now, von Braun was responsible for the world's first long-range ballistic missile powered by liquid fuel. But this missile was not about, and this missile did cross the boundary between Earth and outer space. It's sort of an arbitrary boundary. But this feat of engineering wasn't for science, it was a weapon. It was the V2 rocket. And here's what they looked like. And where I'm talking from right now, down in Docklands in London, a lot of V2s hit around this area. It killed thousands of people in this country, in Belgium, and in the factories where it was built. So as the Nazi war effort was collapsing, there was a race to seize these V2 rockets and also to seize the plans for them and the scientists that developed them. The Soviet Union sent in a team, and Korolev was in that team. But the Americans also sent in a team. And Wernher von Braun really didn't want to get grabbed by the Soviet Union, so he took his top scientists and surrendered to the Americans. And this is actually a photograph of him surrendering to the Americans. And he has a spectacularly broken arm here due to a car crash, nothing to do with V2 rockets. But this is Wernher von Braun going over to the American side. Now, if you want to see a V2 rocket, there's one in the Science Museum in London. So for a moment in time, von Braun and Korolev were very close, but they never met. But they were destined to become rivals. Wernher von Braun and his men went to the States, and the Americans used them to develop their missile technology, but without much of a sense of urgency. But in the Soviet Union, Korolev had set a bold agenda. This man was fearless. He had survived the purges. He felt that his mission was rockets. And he developed one in 1953 that was powerful enough to reach Western Europe. The Americans still weren't alarmed enough to give von Braun more support. They still were relying on conventional weapons, meaning aircraft. And von Braun and his men were kicking their heels in rural Texas, which they didn't really enjoy very much, eating American food they hated, and getting paid $6 a day. Then something unexpected happened. Very random and unexpected. The International Geophysical Year was declared. Now, this is something that used to happen every 50 years. And it was time to start in July 1957 to coincide with a period of increased solar activity. Now, this is very interesting if you're an academic dealing with meteorology, oceanography, seismology, but it wasn't exactly front page news. Now, President Eisenhower, who was in the White House, they slipped out a little press release saying that to mark the International Geophysical Year, that the U.S. would launch a small Earth-circling satellite. Earth-circling. Notice the word orbit wasn't really even in the everyday vocabulary. Now, this press release wasn't much noticed outside of the scientific community, but it gave Sergei Korolev in the Soviet Union the ammunition he needed to push his pet project, which was to launch a satellite. He saw the fine hand of Wernher von Braun on the American side, and Korolev knew he was a man that was capable of making this happen. And remember that at that point, only a few hundred people in the world probably understood the significance of what a satellite was. Now, Korolev not only knew about satellites, he knew how to light a fire underneath the people that could back him. And he went to the Kremlin and he said, the Americans are in an advanced state of development on satellites. He was also a good spin doctor, you can see. Well, that caught their attention. So Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, said to him, okay, as long as the development of our weapons isn't compromised, go ahead and launch your little satellite. So the starting pistol had been fired, and what happened next transformed our world. This is what happened next. Sputnik. Now, Sputnik was launched on October 4th, 1957. The world's first satellite. It was about the size of a beach ball. It's about this size and had long antennas, as you can see. And it took 98 minutes to orbit the Earth. Now, at first, there was disbelief that such a launch was even possible. When Moscow released photos and people could actually see in the sky, not Sputnik, but the R-7 rocket booster that had pushed it up there, they could see this with their naked eye. And, as a stroke of genius, Korolev had put a radio transmitter inside of Sputnik. And so it beeped. Beep, beep, beep. And so the impact was enormous. Sputnik electrified the world. And this was the first satellite ever. Nothing man-made had ever orbited the Earth before in outer space. Sputnik was astonishing and Sputnik was terrifying. The space age had started. A media frenzy helped create what was called the Sputnik Crisis in the United States. Horrified Americans worried that an orbiting Sputnik meant the Soviet Union was now able to launch an intercontinental ballistic weapon at them. The New York Times said that the launch had been a major global propaganda and a prestige triumph for Russian communism. Science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke said that the day Sputnik orbited the Earth, America became a second-rate power. Sputnik had become a symbol of American weakness. It took a few days, the world before social media, before it was apparent to Moscow that Sputnik had rocked the planet and delivered this spectacular propaganda victory. It was far beyond what they expected. So Khrushchev calls in Korolev and says, more, I want more. And across Atlantic, somebody else was asking for more. Wernher von Braun used the Soviet success to push Washington to give him more money and more backing for his missile program. So back in the USSR, Korolev and his team give up sleep And 4 weeks later, on the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Sputnik 2 was launched, and it carried a passenger. Here we are. And here's the passenger, Laika the dog. Yes, I know. Ah, poor Laika. Yes, it was poor Laika, because reentry hadn't been perfected, and Korolov's team knew that Laika was on a one-way ticket. Laika, like all the other Soviet space dogs, was a stray that was found on the Moscow streets. So they thought a stray dog living in Moscow through all those cold winters, tough little dog, good for a space journey. Now, one of the scientists felt so sorry for Laika that he took her home the night before her launch to let his children play with her. He said he wanted to give her a little happiness. Laika's flight caught the imagination of the world and the cause of more astonishment. And also, in this country, people were outraged because we loved animals here. Oh my gosh, we're missing a picture. Laika died of overheating after a few hours, and subsequent dogs were ejected from capsules and survived. But a Soviet dog orbiting the Earth in Sputnik 2 really alarmed the Americans even more. Now, I've stood next to a model of Sputnik 2, and it's a little bit taller than I am, so it was big enough to carry a hydrogen bomb. This was a really serious threat. So within weeks, the Americans launched a Vanguard rocket carrying their satellite. It exploded within 4 seconds of launch. 2 months later, the next Vanguard rocket was launched. It had 10 seconds before it exploded. Finally, 5 months after Sputnik, the Americans successfully launched a satellite into space, and a few months later, NASA was created. The United States intended to catch up, but it was going to take a while. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, 26-year-old pilot Yuri Gagarin was going through an assortment of torturous tests. That he wanted nothing other than to fly. Ever since he, as a child, saw a Soviet fighter crash land and survive during the Nazi invasion, he wanted to take to the skies. And although many of his fellow pilots that were training as cosmonauts were just as tough and just as skilled, Yuri Gagarin was chosen not only because of his politically correct peasant background, but because of what Khrushchev said was his open smile. And if we look at a picture of Gagarin here, he does have a very nice open smile. So he was still smiling on the 12th of April, 1961, when he was launched into space in his Vostok capsule. And for nearly 2 hours, Gagarin saw something that no human being had ever seen before, the Earth from space. Now, because of the secrecy of the Soviet program, Gagarin hadn't been allowed to tell his parents that he was a cosmonaut, what he was doing, where he was going. But he did manage to speak to them before this flight and told them he was going on a business trip. And they said, "How far?" And he said, "Well, very far," which was the right answer. So Gagarin left the Earth as a second lieutenant and was promoted to a major in the course of his flight. So he landed as a major, which confused his father, who was listening to the radio reports of a Major Gagarin landing safely after orbiting the Earth. Gagarin, he thought, well, that's a coincidence. Now, what we didn't know until the end of the Soviet Union was that his craft crash-landed because they hadn't worked out retro rockets and parachutes. So all the Soviet cosmonauts, Gagarin and the others, for the next 3 years, they had to eject and parachute down. Meanwhile, back in Florida at NASA, they're working 16 hours a day to build the Mercury mission, which was the first stage of the American flight, American human flight program. And an enterprising journalist rang up the press officer at 5:30 in the morning, having heard the overnight news that Gagarin had landed safely. And he said, what's happening down here? What's happening with the American program? And the press officer, whom I feel sorry for, shouted into the phone, "We're all asleep down here." So the next morning, the headlines, of course, said, Soviets put man in space. Spokesman says U.S. asleep. Well, Gagarin's, that was the British paper talking about Laika. The Red Pupnik, world asks how to get her down. Apologies, in the wrong order. When Gagarin's flight was broadcast on radio and television, there was literally spontaneous celebrations. People streamed out of their offices, out of their factories, out of their schools, and they went out on the streets and celebrated. The Soviet Union is still recovering from the Second World War. This was the most remarkable and cheering news. And Gagarin became this enormous celebrity. Streets were named after him. Babies were named after him. He was sent on a world tour. He even came to the UK. So 4 weeks after Gagarin circled the globe, the Americans finally get a man in space, Alan Shepard. He gets launched from Cape Canaveral, and he does a suborbital flight, meaning he just goes up and down. He goes into outer space. He doesn't orbit. The flight only lasted 15 minutes, but it cheered up the Americans. But something very significant happened because of this. NASA's chief administrator, James Webb, used this feel-good factor in Washington to persuade Kennedy of what was really the most bold and most audacious plan ever conceived. They didn't have the technology, they didn't have the materials, they didn't have any aspect of it ready. It was the Apollo program. The Soviets may be able to beat us on short-term goals, Webb told Kennedy, but we can go to the moon. So 3 weeks after this, Kennedy gives one of the most remarkable speeches of the 20th century. He says, we choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And he promised to land man on the moon and return him safely before the end of the decade. Now, back in the Soviet Union, Korolov's team were too busy to worry about Kennedy's speech. They launched the first manned flight, lasting a full day, and then simultaneous flights, and a record-breaking flight of nearly 5 days. It was one first after another. But the U.S. had started catching up, and in February 1962, John Glenn became the first American, this is his Mercury craft, Friendship 7, to orbit the Earth. John Glenn became an enormous American hero. But the Soviet Union still had some surprises. The next year after this, they send up the first woman in space, the first woman cosmonaut. I was lucky enough to meet her when she came to the Science Museum, Valentina Tereshkova. Now, she was a 26-year-old textile worker who was obsessed with space, and she applied to be a cosmonaut. And they accepted her because she was a champion parachutist, and the cosmonauts were still having to parachute out. And she actually was a remarkably good cosmonaut. Interesting stories about her. By the way, it was another 20 years before the Americans get a woman in space. This is 1963, and it wasn't until 1983 that Sally Ride goes up to the space station, the space shuttle. So the Soviets had now the Soviets solve the reentry problem, and they have efficient parachutes, but they choose always to land in their enormous landmass, while the Americans always chose to land in oceans. Actually, the Earth absorbs the impact a little bit better, but the Soviets and the Russians subsequently always believed that is safer to land on land than water. So the next Soviet first was in 1965, when a cosmonaut found himself in a tight spot, literally. Alexei Leonov became the first human to perform a spacewalk. And there he is. And I don't know if you're seeing the video, but I am. Now, in his own words, He said, when I opened the hatch, it took my breath away. I felt insignificant, like a tiny ant, compared to the immensity of the universe. At the same time, I felt enormously powerful. I felt the power of the human intellect that had put me there. And there he is, Alexei Leonov, who sadly died a year ago this month, and somebody I was lucky enough to meet. And there he is floating around. His exhilaration only lasted 10 minutes before his fellow cosmonaut in the capsule summoned him to return. But what we don't quite see very well here is the fact that he discovered that his spacesuit had inflated enormously, and his hands had fallen out of his gloves, his feet had come out of his boots, and there was no way he was going to be able to fit back in to the capsule. So without saying so on the open microphone that he was on, he decided on a high-risk strategy. There was a valve on his arm that could bleed out some of the oxygen, which he did, and at the risk of actually losing all of his oxygen. So he was able to get back into the little capsule. But their troubles were only just starting, because no sooner had he got back in than they discovered that their automatic guidance system had failed, and they had to correct their orbit manually for reentry. And they realized that they were not going to land on their target. Now, Leonov decided that Western Siberia was going to be the best bet because it's big, but he wanted to be able to land there because if they went further, they would land in communist China, where there was very bad relationships with the USSR at that point. So he radioed mission control to tell them this change of plan, but there was no answer. Now, remember that the computing power that contained in a spacecraft was minimal in those days, when something like a reentry angle had to be recalculated. And reentry angles are really important, because if you come in at a very shallow reentry angle, you will literally bounce off the atmosphere, and you're not going to get a second chance. And if you come in too steeply, you won't be able to lose speed on time, and you will burn up. These are not good options. But they got the angle right, and they re-entered the atmosphere. But as they landed, they felt a much softer than they expected jolt. And then they couldn't open their hatch. And after a struggle, they realized it was because they were jammed in a grove of birch trees. And in fact, there was thousands and thousands of acres of birch trees because they'd landed in, probably millions, in the middle of the Siberian forest. And eventually they rocked free, aided by the fact that the searingly hot spacecraft melted the snow underneath. Their only means of communication at that point was Morse code transmitter, and on which they sent. But they had no idea if anyone had heard their message. Actually, they had, but also had been picked up in West Germany. So I have to quote from what Leonov said at this point. He wrote, we had landed in the natural habitat of bears and wolves. It was spring and the mating system when both animals are at their most aggressive. We only had one pistol aboard our craft. The firearm I'd stowed away at the last moment, but we had plenty of ammunition. Now, these guys, these were real cosmonauts. Let's put a pistol in the capsule as well. It was just their own decision. And it was probably gave them a feeling of security at that point. So after a terrible night at 30 below, they heard voices in the morning. It was a rescue party skiing towards them on skis and bringing supplies. The forest was too thick for helicopters to land. So they had food and they built a big fire and a shelter, but it took another day before they could ski out to a clearing that had been made. So the first man who walked in space had to complete his journey by using Morse code, 19th century technology, and skis. Leonov is an artist, and he painted many versions of this. But here he is, floating doing his spacewalk above the Black Sea. So that was wonderful. But so for years, the Soviets had much better rocketry than Americans, and thanks to Korolev. And like the Americans, they also wanted to shoot for the moon. But things were about to change. Korolev, who had always suffered from fragile health after his time in Siberia, died after a routine operation. And Khrushchev, Premier Khrushchev, had been deposed by Brezhnev, who really wasn't interested in space and, in fact, seemed to actively dislike the cosmonauts because they were very popular. When Yuri Gagarin died in a fighter plane accident, an era seemed to pass. And so the super heavy rockets that you need for a manned moon mission were never developed in the Soviet Union. They did send an unmanned probe to the moon before the Americans arrived there, Luna 9. So 3 years later, in 1969, Apollo 11 landed on Tranquility Base, and the Soviet Union completely gave up their lunar ambitions. Here is a photograph of Buzz Aldrin placing one of the scientific instruments on the moon. Every mission took different scientific instruments to the moon, and many of them are still sitting up there. Most of the pictures are of Buzz Aldrin that you see on Apollo 11, but there is one picture that Buzz took of Neil Armstrong on the moon. This is after they've been walking on the moon for the first time, and they're back in the capsule and just in the very long process of taking their spacesuits off. And they're exhausted. They haven't slept now for a couple of days properly. But Neil Armstrong is really, you can see how happy he is. This is my favorite photograph of Neil Armstrong. So the cosmonauts and the astronauts really did admire each other, and there was occasional meetings between them in international venues, and there was heartfelt mourning whenever there was any deaths on either side. And in fact, the commander of Apollo 15, David Scott, when he went to the moon, dropped this little plaque on the moon. Now, there's a little spaceman sculpture here. This is a photograph he took, and it's sitting up on the moon to this day. And on that card is a list of at that point, 14 names of astronauts and cosmonauts who had died trying to pursue the goal of manned spaceflight. There was this feeling of solidarity. The Americans landed on the moon a total of 6 times, and the final 3 missions brought lunar rovers, which allowed the astronauts and eventually, on the final mission, an astronaut geologist, to range more widely. They would go to different parts of the moon, covered more grounds. They did a lot of amazing research. By the way, these 3 moon buggies are still there, so if anybody wants to come with me, we have some vehicles up there already to get around. So Apollo 17 in December 1972 was the last of the moon missions. 3 more had been scheduled. They were canceled due to lack of interest and lack of funds. But the legacy of Apollo is still revealing to us amazing knowledge. The different missions all brought back moon rocks, a total of 382 kilos of them. And they were all sealed in vacuum packs. And only half of those rocks actually have been opened. Every year, scientists and labs around the world put in requests to NASA for a little bit of moon rock to do more research. And 50 years on, of course, the instrumentation is so much better, and we've been learning an amazing thing about these moon rocks. So a few more kilos of moon rocks are unsealed and every year for experiments. So what did the Soviet Union do? They'd given up on the moon. They turned their amazing expertise to space stations, and they built space stations to look at the effects of humans in long-term missions and do a lot of science. They had their first space station was called Salyut, which was followed by Space Station Mir. Mir meaning peace. Now, Mir, here it is. and you can see the huge solar arrays that were used to power it. It was orbited for 15 years, and it was permanently inhabited by revolving numbers of cosmonauts, and more than 20,000 different experiments were carried out. Mir lasted so long that it actually outlasted the Soviet Union. It was visited by the American Space Shuttle, by the way, several times, and 7 American astronauts flew on Mir. But when the Soviet Union came to an end in 1991, there was one cosmonaut, Sergei Krikalev. He had arrived at the space station in the March of 91. The chaos of the end of the Soviet Union, the coup against Gorbachev, meant that they didn't go and fetch him when they were supposed to, so he was up on station for more than a year, and he had left as a citizen of the Soviet Union and returned as a citizen of Russia. The space station, the space shuttle, rather, the American space shuttle, after Apollo ended, it was developed as a reusable spacecraft. And although there were 2 disasters, the space shuttle flew 5 different space shuttles flew a total of 135 missions, and it became so routine that it barely merited any media attention. They did some remarkable science and incredible research, actually, and they also deployed satellites, and they also retrieved and serviced a number of satellites that were in Earth orbit. And famously, they repaired the Hubble telescope, and they went up actually twice. But the space shuttle landed for the last time in 2011. Okay, so where are we now? What is the legacy of spaceflight? Well, around our planet right now, thousands of satellites are sending us data minute by minute, our weather patterns on vegetation, on Earth observation, navigation, GPS, intelligence. Now, our knowledge of Earth has been transformed by the satellite technology, that, not to mention our communications. All of this came out of the space race. And there's also the incredible International Space Station, which I love, the ISS. This is the size of a football field, and it has enormous solar arrays, and it has a room that's about equivalent to a 6-bedroom house. This has been up there since the year 2000 and has been inhabited continually. And in fact, the astronauts from 19 different countries have been up there. They usually go for 6-month stints. It's a joint project between NASA, Roscosmos, that's the Russians, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, Canadian Space Agency, and of course ESA, our European Space Agency. And on Wednesday, 2 days ago, they got 3 new passengers, and one of them being Kate Rubins. Now, Kate is up there on her American astronaut. She's up there on her 2nd mission. This is her looking out of cupola on her 1st mission. And this is what happens to your hair in 0 gravity, which would be a problem. But it looks so cool. Now, listen, you can easily spot the International Space Station when it's overhead, even through light-polluted London. So just go on the NASA website and sign up for alerts wherever you are. So what else? An array of spacecraft are also traveling through the solar system, providing research, and some of them really essential information. Now, this is a picture of the sun, and 2 of the dozen or so satellites that are spread between Earth orbit and much closer to the sun that are monitoring the sun. They're monitoring what's called space weather. Now, space weather is keeping track of solar flares and the bigger things that happen. There's the solar flares and then the really big ones, which are called coronal mass ejections. Those are the kind of things that we have to look out for, and these satellites can detect them and give warnings to aircraft companies, because it affects navigation of flights, also power companies, because a big flare can disable not only GPS navigation, but also it can melt power grids, so they react appropriately and turn things off. So we need to keep a careful watch on the sun, our local star that gives us life, can also cause a lot of chaos. And then there is Mars. The Mars missions. 3 Mars missions took off in July, because every 2 years there's a window to launch to Mars because of our elliptical orbits around the sun. And they are a wonderful NASA mission, the Mars 2020, with a fabulous new rover on it, and one from the UAE and another one from the Chinese that we don't know much about because they don't share information. They will reach Mars in February. It takes 8 years to get to Mars. Now, there's some staggeringly clever missions which have done amazing research on Mars, on the planet and circling it. But my favorite is, let's have a look at it. The Mars Curiosity, yay! It landed in August 2012, and not only has it done a lot of cool things, it trundles around and picks up things and examines them, but it takes selfies, and this is a selfie by the Mars rover. And in fact, you can go on the NASA website and download your daily selfie from the Mars Curiosity, which to me is more thrilling than most of my friends' Facebook selfies. There's Curiosity. And by the way, this month, Mars is the closest it's been to Earth for several years, a mere 38 million miles away. So go outside and look, and there's a lot of apps and guides that will tell you where you're going to have the best view. Mars is a unique planet with an atmosphere and a climate. And it has the diverse and complex geology that's not unlike Earth. So, will there ever be a manned mission to Mars? Here's another view of Mars. This is some of the ice fields on Mars. Will there ever be a manned mission of Mars? Well, possibly in the late 2030s. But there's an enormous technical challenge going to Mars. Many enormous technical challenges. But the biggest actually is a limitation of our bodies that were built for this gravity. So don't hold your breath. Other cool missions that are coming up in the solar system. There's a thrilling program called JUICE, which is a European Space Agency mission to the icy moons of Jupiter, where there may be microbial light. It's due to launch in 2022. It will take a mere 8 years to get there. Did I hear anyone ask about Saturn? Well, we're still analyzing the exceptional data from the Cassini-Huygens mission. Let's have a look at one of the pictures Cassini took for us. Now, Cassini took 7 years to reach Mars, and then it spent 13 years beaming back data. It dived through the rings of Saturn. We know much more about them. We know that there's more moons on Saturn than we had spotted before, and it did flybys of Enceladus, which is one of the moons that we think that we are pretty sure because it tasted the what's streaming out of Enceladus, which it turned out to be water. And also it looked at Titan. These are 2 moons that we believe may harbor bacterial life. So Cassini actually probably sent back enough data that will keep scientists busy for several decades. This is 13 years of high quality data and amazing pictures. You can find them online. What other cool things are happening? Well, next week, a spacecraft called Osiris-Rex will be collecting a sample. Here's little Osiris-Rex. This isn't a real picture. This is an artist's view of it. We'll be collecting a sample from an asteroid and returning it to Earth. Now, you'll hear a lot of reports next week, I think, about Osiris-Rex getting onto the asteroid. I believe it's scheduled to touch down there on Monday. Now, this is the first sample from another celestial body since Apollo that will be brought back to Earth. And then James Webb. Now, remember, James Webb was an amazing NASA administrator that persuaded Kennedy that we could go to the moon. This is the new telescope called the James Webb. It's going to be launched next year, and it is going to be viewing the universe in infrared. And unlike the Hubble, which is in low Earth orbit, may mean that it'll just within a few hundred miles of Earth, James Webb will be 1 million miles away. It will be able to look literally back in time, because the telescopes do look back in time, looking at stars that formed planetary systems in the early universe, and it will be beaming us back just remarkable data. The Hubble telescope, which has done amazing work, is 30 years old, and you may have seen some of the wonderful programs about the Hubble earlier this year. This is typical of one of Hubble's images. This is called the Iris Nebula. Just remarkable things we've learned from Hubble. So, can you believe it's nearly 48 years since man walked on the moon? But just a few years ago, those moon rocks that we talked about revealed some new information to us, that there is water on the moon, and it's locked in the moon in deep craters. Now, this is key for future moon missions, which are scheduled to start in 2024. I think that is overly ambitious, probably slip. But we will see men and women on the moon again, and in this decade. And this is an artist's impression of what it will look like. They're going to land on the moon's south pole. This is the south pole, apparently. And they are going to establish a permanent base there, rather like the way we have a permanent base at our own South Pole on this planet. It's part of the Artemis project. Artemis is the sister of Apollo. So we have spacecraft that have been tested and are ready to go. The Chinese are also aiming to have a moon base, and their Chang'e lander successfully touched down on the far side of the moon last year and sent back some very interesting data. But in this new space age, some of the biggest developments are from the private sector. Elon Musk, a SpaceX program, and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin program. Now, those two different companies have reduced the cost of space travel by up to 75% because they reuse the rockets that carry the fuel, which is a very expensive part of the vehicle. And you've probably been helping Jeff Bezos in this effort because he also owns Amazon, and I think people have been using Amazon a lot lately. And his Blue Origin space program has been chosen by NASA to build the lunar landers that will be used in this Artemis project. But SpaceX, Elon Musk's SpaceX, has already ferried their first astronauts to the International Space Station. They came back in August, and here is the capsule called the Dragon, being picked up off the sea, a little bit seared from returning through the reentry process. And this was from August, bringing back safely the two astronauts who spent 2 months, I think it was, or 3 months on the International Space Station. And Dragon is going to launch 4 American astronauts from Cape Canaveral next month up to the International Space Station. So in the way that Silkowski, that Russian back in the 19th century, was inspired by reading Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, Elon Musk is a passionate lover of science fiction, and his programs is full of references. One of the spacecraft dummies they used at the beginning was called Ripley, and the launch vehicle that will be is the Falcon. So fans of Star Wars and Alien will appreciate these references, and there's far more. So, spurred on initially by the Cold War and a thirst for propaganda victories, and also developing rocketry for military purposes, spaceflight has transformed our lives. There's more than 550 women and men that have now traveled, orbited the Earth, and 24 of them have gone into deep space. So what has the space race done for us? It's spurred the development of computer chips and camera miniaturization, new materials, some of which will be in your sports clothes, instant global communications, and the GPS. And all the research that was done by NASA and the European Space Agency is open source. It's available to everyone. But just as important as the science that space travel has brought us, our cosmonauts, our astronauts have fueled our sense of magic and our dreams of traveling to other planets, to other galaxies, and it's made us understand the universe a lot better. So I'm going to finish with telling you about a remarkable spacecraft that was launched in 1977 that's crossed out of our space solar system. It's crossed out of our solar system, away from the solar wind of our sun into interstellar space. After flying past the four icy giants of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. At least 6 of its scientific instruments are still in operation and will probably be transmitting information to us for several more years. They're beaming back data to Earth with a power equivalent only to the light bulb that's in your refrigerator. So science fiction to science fact. Now, this was the Voyager spacecraft. And the late Carl Sagan, who has worked with it, had an inspired idea. As Voyager was leaving our solar system, he asked Voyager to turn around and take a picture pointing back to Earth. And this circle, there's a circle around a little blue dot. You've probably seen this photo before. And I'm going to end on Carl Sagan's words about this. He said, "Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived their lives. The aggregate of our joy and our suffering on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam." So yes, space travel is astonishing. Let's be astonished. We do live in a time of wonder. Now, thanks very much. And I would like you to remind you that on Spaceship Earth are also living the people that we are trying to help right now through Bermondsey Welcomes Refugees. So go to the website and you know what to do. And go out in the sky, go outside and start looking at the skies. There's amazing things. Thank you.
Thank you, Tira. We have a few questions. Not everyone was able to send questions in, unfortunately, but a few did manage to get through. So let me give you the first question.
We have some questions here. Yes, okay, I'm listening to the first one, yes.
Melissa Pinaweir from Ottawa, Canada. She wants to know how long it took for the first satellite to circle the globe.
How long did it take for the first satellite to circle the globe? That's a really good question. Sputnik, I think, circled the globe in 98 minutes, but that actually is pretty standard because of the way that satellites, because of physics, essentially, satellites are always, the average time for almost any satellite and the International Space Station is between sort of 92 and 98 minutes, which means they're going at 17,000 miles an hour, which is 24,000 kilometers an hour. So they're going fast.
Thank you. And we have a question from Sue Phillips from France.
Sue Phillips' question.
And
yes.
she wants to know if you think there will ever be an all-woman space capsule.
Ah, that's a good one. That's a good question. Well, about 1/5 of the astronauts now have been women. They've been there's a lot of in NASA and the American space program. There's a lot of women, but also in the European Space Agency. There's been some wonderful women. I spent some time at the European Space Agency at one point, and I met two women, one of whom had just come down from the space station. Caddy Coleman, who is an American astronaut, who's also a concert flautist, and pretty remarkable. And then also Samantha Cristoforetti, who's an Italian astronaut, who was about to go up, and also is a remarkable scientist. She just published her autobiography about this, The Diary of an Apprentice Astronaut, last month, which is super. I'd recommend it. And she also managed to get the first espresso machine in the International Space Station, which is a first for Italy. Hurrah.
Caroline Lacey from London, she is asking if you believe that there is life on other planets.
Is there life on other planets? Well, not necessarily of the little green men variety, but we think that there's probably bacterial life possibly on some of the moons of Saturn and Jupiter, Enceladus and Titan and Europa, and there's a school of thought that life is actually much more common in the universe than we have believed. So I think over the next decade or so, we're going to have much more of an insight to it. But it's a fascinating question.
And I think we've just got time for one more question. The Americans brought up 3 space buggies to the moon. We want to know what happened to them.
What happened to those 3 space buggies? And also, the Russians sent 2 space buggies, unmanned space buggies called lunokoids. Now, those American space buggies are sitting up there, probably having very strongly irradiated by the sun, so they probably are looking a bit different. Whether we could turn the key in them and make them work again, unlikely. One of the Soviet ones was sold to a collector who wanted to own a property on the moon. The son of an American astronaut bought it. And so they said, we don't think we're going to be able to deliver it to you. And he went, doesn't matter, I just want to buy it. And they took his money. So there's 5 different craft up there, but let's go up to the moon and see if we can make any of them work again.
Actually, we've got time for one more. So how long would a Mars mission take?
A Mars mission, it's at the closest point, it's going to take 8 months each way. But then you have to spend time on the planet, and actually you would probably you would have to wait for the next window for 8 months. So it would be several years, and the effect on the human body, we are not really built for 0 gravity or even a 60% gravity like Mars had. It would be very serious, and that's one of the main limitations of a Mars mission.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and let's keep looking upwards.